Hello and welcome to another episode of the Folklore podcast. I'm Mark Norman, folklore researcher and author. This episode is part of the Folklore podcast Rewind series. This is where I take old interviews from the last 2 or 3 seasons that have not been released for one reason or another and bring them to you as part of my effort to bring more content your way during the entirety of this, the 10th anniversary season of the podcast. In this interview, you will hear and see, if you're watching this on YouTube, Liz Williams. Liz is an award-winning historian, writer and occultist who lives and works out of Glastonbury in the United Kingdom, one of the esoteric hubs in this country. Liz is the author of science fiction titles and various other books, including Miracles of Our Own Making, A History of Paganism. This has been published in 2020 by Reaktion Books, and you'll find a review of the title on the Folklore podcast website. In this interview, Liz discusses paganism, her own work as a druid, and various other issues surrounding the book, and I hope you enjoy it.
Hi, I'm here to talk to Liz Williams about her book, Miracles of Our Own Making, A History of Paganism. Hi.
Hello, nice to see you.
Yeah, it's very nice to see you. So, this is, as the title implies, a history of paganism, and it goes from the very ancient origins up to the modern practices. And it was Ronald Hutton who actually said in his little blurb on it that we finally have a history of paganism written by a practicing pagan.
Yes, extremely kind and slightly ironic, but there we go.
So you've actually been practicing for some time.
Yeah, for a long time, really. I was brought up in a non-Christian household, by which I mean that in standard British format, we sort of occasionally went to church at Christmas, but really we were pretty secular. This is actually quite a secular country now. It's not a very religious country. And throughout the 60s and 70s, my parents were absolutely typical in that they didn't go to church. But we did have a lot of books on mythology and magic in the household. My father was an amateur stage magician, not an occultist, but he didn't really discriminate in the books that he brought into the house. Some of them were about, quotes, real magic, and some of them were about conjuring. And he and my mother were both very interested in mythology, so they had a lot of books on mythology. So I kind of grew up with that as reading material, really. And I didn't really deviate from that. So when I was in my late teens, I started looking into paganism and things like the tarot and astrology, which, I'm still into. So I'm 57 now, so it's been quite a long time that I've been essentially interested in paganism. It's been taking off, in Britain. It started here in the 50s, really, with Wicca and Druidry. This is the sort of form that we're espousing now, and heathenism to some extent, but that came a little bit later. Or much earlier, depending on how you look at it. But essentially, it was around at the time that I was a teenager in the early 1980s. I knew a couple of people who were Wiccans. I knew somebody who professed to be a Satanist. I kind of doubt that he was, but the interest in the occult and that sort of thing was definitely around. And this is a very small country.
Mm-hmm.
So although it wasn't mainstream, it's not that difficult to run across people who are into, some form of alternative spirituality, alternative religion, some form of magic.
But it is getting to be a little bit more mainstream, to my understanding.
Very much so, yes. And here as well as the States, I think.
Oh, yeah. I've, one of the things that I've been noticing, and Miranda Aldhouse Green actually mentioned in her recent book about Druidry, was that there's been a massive increase in people who are interested in various forms of paganism and polytheism.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's definitely growing. There are about, I think the last count for the Order of Bards, Ophos and Druids, of which I was a member, it was upward of about 20,000 people worldwide.
Yeah.
Which is quite big, really, for an alternative, spiritual path.
Oh, definitely. And over the past couple of years, the past 3 years in particular, there's been a massive increase. There's the phenomenon of witch talk on TikTok, which is particularly interesting and
absolutely.
there's some quite good things mixed in with some quite ridiculous things on there, as
Yeah.
one might expect.
Yeah, it's the internet, isn't it, really? It's it started when I started getting onto it. I've had email for since 1987, because I had it in academia, and there weren't obviously the forums and the net groups and the net chats then, but those started coming along in the 90s. And that was when things like Buffy and Charmed were at their height. And so there were, the same sort of groups of mainly young women getting into witchcraft then through those shows are, I think, the same. They're not the same generation, but they're the same type of people who are now on Witch Talk, and who are looking at the net for some of the solutions to the answers that they have. And it's just another tool, really.
Yeah, and it's interesting how many of the people who get into this stuff do tend to be women,
Yeah, absolutely.
or otherwise, marginalized groups.
Yes.
And you mentioned in your book, that some of that might be owing to, the traditions that were espoused by, people like Margaret Murray back in the day.
Yeah.
And while, Margaret Murray's notion of the, witch cult is
Yes.
pretty firmly disproven at this point, it
Yes.
still can prove to be a rather valuable idea.
Yeah, I think she was taking off from late Victorians like Ellen Jane Harrison. I think the name is. She was very influential in anthropological circles, and some of these people are, they're not to be underestimated, really, because although the content of what they were saying wouldn't come up to historical standards of rigor and methodology today, but they were interesting, and they were kind of getting this whole thing started in a sense. And I kind of, I look back to them and I respect them for the work that they did do, whilst from a contemporary perspective, slightly decrying the standards of scholarship. But they did get us started, and so did the women of the Golden Dawn, Annie Horniman, Florence Farr, all that group of people. And okay, there are elements of privilege involved because these are quite wealthy people who have a lot of time and a lot of contacts. They're up at the upper echelons of society. They're not working class, really. But they're contributing to the magical occult mix of 20th century Britain. And I think those people, we should really be honouring them, insofar as we can.
Well, without them
sense.
having paid a certain amount of the way, we wouldn't have ended up with people like Dorian Valiente.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yes. And many more, really. And so quite a few people who are still alive. So it's it's nice to see that level of continuity and that element of continuity. I was talking to people at the weekend who knew Gareth Knight, people who knew Dion Fortune. That sort of lineage is still very much alive and still going strong, and I think that's that's a nice example of magical continuity, really. And we definitely should be celebrating that, while at the same time giving a bit of airtime to the younger generation, because they'll come up and do things that we didn't think of, or didn't really consider. So they're not, although I have a bit of an issue sometimes with people reinventing the wheel, maybe that's a necessary thing for every generation, and they're bound to come up with something new.
Well, one of the things that I find particularly interesting with this current generation, and is the amount of rigor that they're putting into the academic studies.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and that's gaining traction, and it's partly gaining traction because they're able to get funding for it. In Britain, it's academia is tough. It's tough all over the place. Some things get funded more than others, but there are definitely more than green shoots. I mean, Ronald, who is a personal friend, has just been made Gresham Professor of Theology. I didn't know if you were aware of this.
Oh, that's fantastic.
That's it's a prestigious post, and some of his forebears at Gresham include people like Isaac Newton. This is a major post, and they have explicitly said to him that they're basically making him Professor of Theology because he's a pagan, not in spite of it. And that's a really big step, because I think his immediate predecessor was an atheist, but everybody up until then has been Christian.
That's amazing.
Lineage of, it is remarkable. We were, I have to say, surprised. He's also been elected to the Athenaeum as well, which is pretty major.
Oh, yeah.
And it's good to see that sort of level of visibility. It's and he's not single-handedly, but he has done an enormous amount to essentially publicize paganism within academia and to make it respectable.
I think it's absolutely amazing. And
Yes.
the amount of work that's being done to actually, trace the history of paganism, to bring, academic rigor to it, like
Yeah,
you did with
absolutely.
this book, is just beautiful, because it means that the foundation that's being built is much stronger than it previously has been.
Yeah, I certainly hope so. I mean, I think I do notice a degree of more rigor creeping into online discussions. People like Mara Starling, who is a Welsh witch, she's doing an enormous amount to try and sort of, correct misperceptions, because she's a native Welsh speaker, quite apart from anything else. And I think that sort of methodology is really very helpful. We don't want to get too bogged down in it.
Yes.
I don't want to sort of say to people, you can't do a ritual with gods from Ireland and gods from the Welsh tradition, who probably aren't gods anyway, because it's mixing traditions and you don't want to do that. Actually, I think you probably do want to do it and see what happens.
Yeah.
But it's being aware of where it comes from, and being aware of where some of the words and terminology comes from, because these are still living languages. They're very vibrant languages, and they do belong to somebody. So, we want to be a bit careful about the whole appropriation thing without killing everything off entirely.
That's been coming up a lot in discussions of
Yeah,
Irish traditions as well.
yeah, absolutely.
Especially in America, there's a long tradition of mucking up a lot of Irish.
Yes, well, Irish Gaelic is fiendishly difficult to pronounce. So is
Yes.
Welsh.
Oh, yes.
And I mean, I'm learning Welsh at the moment. I am Welsh, but my family don't speak it. And I think my grandfather spoke it, but he learned it because I come from a part of Wales. My family comes from a part of Wales. I'm actually born in Gloucester, where traditionally they did not speak Welsh. They haven't for hundreds of years. And so I am learning the language, but it's very, very difficult.
Oh,
And I do feel
certainly.
that, if Doctor Who comes up and whisks me back to medieval Wales, I shall be booting my ancestors in the shins for some of their mutations. Because, good Lord, how is anybody supposed to pronounce some of this? And they say that Welsh is consistent to pronounce. It is, but yeah, it's not.
Yes.
So, yeah. So, I mean, go gently on yourselves.
Yeah, I'm really impressed with the amount of work that's being done into trying to recreate, some of the, ancient traditions. And
Yes.
one of the things that I particularly appreciated that you brought to the forefront in a large way with your book, and with the appendice that you wrote, was regarding the shamanistic tradition.
Right. Yes.
Because that's been there's more and more work that's being done about how that was practiced within just about everywhere in ancient times. But the way that it's being done now is a little bit different to how it would have been done then, and
Yes.
there are a certain degree of difficulties in translating it,
Yes.
due to how it's still being practiced within certain indigenous communities.
Yeah, it very definitely is. And I suspect that a lot of Celtic, I'm using this term very, very loosely, by the way, but let's look at sort of Gaul, Cornwall, parts of Britain, Wales, Ireland, Scotland, Isle of Man. The people who ended up there, I think they would have practiced something that was very similar to shamanism, or a kind of shamanism, but we just don't know. And we don't really know the kind of beliefs they had, because, as I say in the book, and as is well known, they didn't write anything down. So what we know from them is made up of what the Romans said about them, which isn't necessarily reliable, and also things like the archaeological records. And a lot of that is surmise and speculation, as is the case with essentially a pre-literate people. So it's very difficult, really, to kind of get a grip on what our ancient Celtic ancestors actually did. But of course, the situation is very different from other parts of the world, because the Greeks are now setting up temples to their older gods. And the Greek literary tradition is obviously very, very ancient. They're one of the most text-based religions,
Yes.
throughout the world. We know exactly what people thought. Whether that really translates into a modern sensibility, I don't know. Possibly not. But we do know what the ancient Greeks wrote about their gods. And I think there are about 3 or 4 temples being set up in mainland Greece, possibly on the islands now, which is really interesting. So it's very very country dependent. Iceland now has a temple. I think, they do have records. I think that some of the Central Europeans do. But it's only the Celts who basically ran around not writing stuff down. Very annoying of them. But there we are.
Yeah, it's fascinating though, and then we have people who came around who started to talk about found traditions,
Yes.
for the Welsh, for the various Celtic traditions, which
Yes.
then further muddied the waters to a certain extent.
Absolutely. Yes. I mean, it's Britain has been subject to waves of immigration from time immemorial, and all of those cultures have brought their gods with them. There are Romano-British gods. I'm sitting probably about 15 miles away from a Romano-British temple site now, out on the coast of Somerset, and that would have been a temple to Mars and somebody. We're not really sure who, because they don't write down the god names.
Yeah.
I'm not very far from Bath, which of course is the home of Sulis Minerva, who is a syncretic deity.
Hmm.
So a lot of these, people would have brought their gods with them, as the Saxons did, the Vikings did. We became Christianized a long time ago, and paganism really didn't last in this country. There isn't some secret pagan tradition, unfortunately. I'd love it if there was, and I used to believe that there was, but I think unfortunately I must bow to evidence that there really isn't very much. But where it did sort of segue into was the early church. So, Saxon charms, which would have resolved around invoking the name of Odin or Loki or Thor, would have been changed into Christ, the Holy Spirit and God. And we've got several examples of those. Same words, different gods.
Yeah, so the tradition did survive to a certain extent, just
To a certain
not
extent, yeah.
the way that
just
people
not,
might have expected it to.
No, it became Christianized. But the actual magical underpinnings of it did remain to some extent. And that's quite interesting. It's like saints. Saints are essentially little gods in the church. But of course, then we had the Reformation, and that did make there was a big break. There was a big juxtaposition. I'm also I'm in Glastonbury, as you know, actually a few miles from Glastonbury. And the whole of Glastonbury is built around an amazing piece of Reformation ruin, in that the big abbey that was the centre of Glastonbury, one of the richest in Europe, was completely trashed by Henry VIII. And it's now, there's not very much of it left. So, the Reformation really did make a big break, not just in terms of Christian practice, but also in terms of magical practice.
But it's thought that there were certain things that could have potentially survived in the cunning people tradition, correct?
Yes, I mean, it's more, I think it's more a constancy of content rather than a constancy of word, if that makes sense. Because the herbs that grow now in the British Isles, the trees that surround us, the woodland plants, those are the same. So if somebody was to go and, gather magical herbs today, and they went to a piece of ancient woodland, they'd be finding much the same thing, despite a bit of climate change and, differences in agriculture.
Yeah.
They would be finding the same plants. The stars in the sky are the same. The astrology is the same. So yeah, definitely there is an element of continuity, because the things on which magic is based remain stable, remain constant. So yeah, I think you can trace it back, but it's probably through slightly different forms. And Ronald did give a very good talk about this once, in which he said there are sort of vestigial things. You get Renaissance magicians using spells that were probably ancient Egyptian.
Oh, definitely.
A little bit. They've changed over time. But whereas in the Egyptian, they would have used the feathers of a hoopoe, as a little bird with a nice crest on its head, this is translated into the lapwing, which is a British bird that has a little crest on its head, because we don't have hoopoes very often in this country. So things, people sort of took the form of something, but they changed it to adapt to their circumstances. And I think people have been doing that all the time. And I think that's actually fine.
Oh,
So
certainly.
this is why I'm not terribly sort of, originalist, if you like, about the absolute form of something, because the sensibility with which we approach it is going to change. We're living in a very different world to our ancestors, and the content is going to change to some extent. So some of it remains the same, but some of it, because we're human, We mix and take and adapt, and we're magpies. We like shiny things from other cultures. A bit too much in the case of the British. We have a terrible track record colonially. But I think these days, as long as you acknowledge where it comes from, I'm not into wholesale appropriation, but I am into influence and inspiration. And actually asking people for a start whether they would mind if you used their stuff. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. They're not a monolithic block.
Yeah, I think it was Dr. John Callow who wrote that one of the tenets of polytheism was indeed that sort of tolerance, that sort of
Yes.
openness to borrowing and changing and
Yes.
adapting, and
Yes.
that's one of the biggest hallmarks that still survives today.
Absolutely. And I mean, there are plenty of arguments in paganism on the net, obviously. And there is the eternal cry of the netizen, "You are doing it wrong," which you're doing Wicca wrong, which is human nature, unfortunately. But what we don't have, as far as I am aware at the moment, is followers of Thor having a crack at followers of Rhiannon, for example. We don't have that kind of, we have internecine argument and debate, but we don't so much have the kind of cross-religious debate and argument within polytheism that, say, sections of the Christian church do.
Mm-hmm.
Christians, a lot of them don't, but some of them do attack paganism and Hinduism and Buddhism, and some Buddhists don't like Hindus, and there's plenty of members of every religion always have a go at other members for any other religion, but paganism has actually been quite free of that in a funny sort of way. So I mean, let's keep it that way. Yeah,
we should
that would be
certainly
nice.
try.
Yeah.
So mentioning what the original religion, so to speak, of Britain would be, that to many people's minds is now Wicca.
Yes, we invented that. I think Ronald is right in that we are the only. I quote Ronald a lot actually because I think he is right. So I'll nail my colours to that mast. He says that it's the only religion that we've ever actually given to the world, and I think he's probably, off the top of my head, I would say that was correct.
Mm-hmm.
And Wicca did take off with remarkable speed and remarkable traction, actually. When you think that it was really only the 30s, 40s, and 50s, that's less than 100 years ago.
And it's still going strong.
It's still going strong, and it's spread worldwide. We ran a witchcraft shop in Glastonbury. We had a lot of Wiccans from places like Mexico and South America.
It's amazing.
And they weren't witches in their own tradition. They were definitely Wiccans, because I checked this out with people. They were Gardnerian or Alexandrian Wiccans. And it's always the case that, other people's stuff is a bit cooler than your stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's partly to do with it. But these are very sincere, committed people. And why not?
Yeah. And, Wicca, to a certain extent, some of the beliefs of Wicca, it's a bit like the Golden Dawn, where it's suffused a lot of magical practice now.
Yes. Yeah, and a lot of Wicca comes out of the Golden Dawn. It comes out of Freemasonry, late 19th century occult societies, not just the Golden Dawn, but some of the Golden Dawn's offshoots, with which people like E. Nesbitt and the Unfortunate were involved in. It comes out of the Rosicrucian tradition. It comes out of a little bit of amateur dramatics, probably, and it's got many kind of origins, which I don't know whether you're familiar in the States with the work of a man called Philip Heselton, who's been doing a lot of work on Gardner and New Forest Wicca. And he's really done a great job, actually, in exploring exactly where Gardner got some of this stuff from. Because I don't personally believe that Gardner, who was a little bit prone to flights of fancy, came across some old school holdout of, an ancient religion in the New Forest. Although there is magic in the New Forest, and some of that, especially through the Romany traditions, is quite old, but it's a bit fragmented, is my understanding of it. And I think he basically got taken on board by a bunch of Rosicrucians, or sort of latter-day Rosicrucians, a couple of whom had Golden Dawn kind of antecedents or Freemasonic antecedents. And it sounds insulting to say he cobbled it together. I think he did a great job, actually. And so did Doreen, and so did, a lot of early Wiccans in actually getting a quite snappy religion, straight out of the gate.
Yeah, I mean, it's brilliant. There's a reason that people are still following it, and there's a
Yeah,
reason that it's
absolutely.
just gaining in popularity in a lot of ways.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, I think it's particularly appealing to women because of the empowerment angle. It's very feminist in many ways, and it's very feminine oriented. But I do know an awful lot of men who are into Wicca as well. And, it does seem to suit a lot of people. And it doesn't proselytize, they're not going around banging on people's doors and trying to convert them. It's not a secret religion in this country anymore.
Hmm.
But it is very much a religion that I think is growing, for sure.
Oh, I definitely think it is. I've met a ton of people, who are practicing it, priestesses in it even. And
Absolutely.
it
Yeah.
has the unique ability to, continue to adapt,
Yes.
as, times are changing.
Yeah.
So,
Absolutely.
there's been a lot of talk, about, the gender binary within it. And
Absolutely. Yeah.
because of the way that Wicca itself works, people have been
Yes.
able to say, oh, this is just the Jungian archetypes of it. So
Yeah. Absolutely.
it can just continue to adapt.
Yes, and I think it should grow and change. I mean, it comes essentially out of the 30s to the 50s, which was quite a conventional time, certainly in terms of gender relationships.
Certainly.
Gardner was probably ahead of his time actually in setting women up as priestesses, but they were a little bit shy of things like homosexuality because it was illegal in Britain
Yeah.
at that point, and that changed from the 60s onwards. But the gender debate and the transgender debate is still relatively new. So people are responding to that. Wicca is changing with regard to that. Druidry is to some extent, although we're less binary. We're still a bit binary in Druidry, and that has changed in recent years,
I
which
think
I'm quite happy with. I don't. I'm not a gender essentialist. I started out with old school feminism, but I think some of that is a little bit too rigid these days.
I think that it's
So
doing really well. I think that just the nature of these religions is the ability to adapt, because there is
yeah,
that
absolutely.
playfulness kind of baked in.
Yeah, there is a playfulness and there's an experimental nature baked in, and also we're not text based, so you can't have, thank God, people going and saying, "Oh, the Wiccan Bible says this, that, and the
Yes.
other." Well, no, because we haven't got one. There might be a few books called that, but we haven't got a text to which we all refer, and I think that's hugely positive actually, because I think that gives us a lot of freedom.
Oh, definitely. You can say that so and so said this, but then you can easily
Yeah.
just have somebody else
Well,
say something else.
yeah, absolutely. I know some people do hark a little bit back to Gardner in a sort of a lineage type way, and I'm not personally into that, but I can see why people do it. But I think there is an awful lot of leeway and margins for us to change and adapt and transform what we're doing.
Yeah. So I thought that your book was absolutely brilliant, as I'm sure that you can tell by
Thank
the
you. That's very
comments.
kind. No, thank you very much. No, I'm glad you find it really helpful.
Yeah, and I had seen that you had had a book come out recently regarding the hand
Mhm.
fasting tradition.
Yes, Llewellyn very kindly asked me to do that. The editor was somebody whom I used to work with on the Wild Hunt. You'd be familiar with the blog. I still write for
Hmm.
the news site. And she asked me if I would do a book on hand fastings out of the blue. So I said, yes, I will. I'd never thought that I would write a book about weddings. I'm not very wedding oriented, really, but it was very interesting. And I enjoyed writing it, and it seems to be well received. So that's fantastic. So yeah, Modern Hand Fastings by Llewellyn. Commercial break is now over.
I thought that it was just really interesting, though, because it kind of speaks to how popular, paganism is becoming, that a book like that could
Totally.
actually come out and do well.
Yeah, I mean, there have been some very good books. Raven Caldera, I think, wrote I think it's Raven Caldera. I hope I haven't got his name wrong. There have been some very good books on hand fasting, but they have been a little bit more ritual based, and this was a sort of a how-to guide. In its original form, it was much more how-to.
Mhm.
Don't do this, don't do that, never do that. And they wanted me to make it actually a little bit more magical. But because I'm a celebrant, I approach everything from a logistical point of view
Yeah.
first. let's get the logistics nailed down before we start going into the spirituality of it. But it was really interesting. I learned a lot about, the practice of hand fasting that I previously didn't know, like the thing about Shakespeare being a celebrant at a hand fasting in Silver Street in London.
That's
He
brilliant.
married his landlady's daughter to some guy, and that was seen as being perfectly normal. Imagine having Shakespeare do your hand fasting.
That would be quite the experience there.
Incredible, yeah. And he wasn't a pagan. This was under a Christian aegis.
Yeah.
But otherwise he wouldn't have been allowed to. It wouldn't have occurred to him to do it, I don't think. But that sort of thing was really interesting, and some of the history of it is fascinating. But it's popular among people who are not even pagan, actually. Quite a few of the hand fastings we do them for people who aren't pagan, and they like the humanist form of it. They like the sort of 4 directions type thing,
Yeah.
and the nature-based quality of it. And I'm totally happy to hand fast people who are not pagan.
Oh,
But
I just think
it's
it's
great.
kind of beautiful.
It's great when they are. It's really nice to be on the same page with somebody. But if they're not, that's cool too.
Oh, and I think it's just beautiful to kind of have that
Yeah, it's a
idea
lovely
of
stuff.
place,
Yes.
written into it.
Yeah, I like place. I'm very landscape based. I'm always very aware of where I am, and the spirits of place. And I think if you're having a hand fasting in somebody's backyard, it's a spirit's backyard. So it's nice to acknowledge that.
Yeah, and I just think it's beautiful that more people are doing that. That more people are getting in tune with the world around
Yeah.
them.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think people do feel a disconnect from the natural world. We're very screen based these days.
Yeah.
I myself find myself being very screen based. I have to take breaks, and as you can see, I'm sitting in a conservatory, so it's quite nice to have nature all around me. But I think a lot of people, if you're in a cubicle in an office, you don't necessarily have windows. People are kind of crying out for some sort of connection a lot of the time. So I think that's really important.
Yeah, I genuinely believe that might be part of why paganism is becoming as popular as it is, because it
I
helps
think it
people
is.
get in touch.
Yeah, I think it is. And I think people are concerned about the state of the world at the moment. The environment is in a terrible state. And I think people are starting to think, well, maybe the idea of kind of custodianship that we used to have in some parts of the Christian tradition isn't working so well.
Hmm.
How can we do better? How can we connect?
Yeah, I see that. I see discussions like that a lot in Druidry
Yeah.
circles, and I've seen that
Yeah.
coming up more in heathenism circles as well, actually.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, heathens are are actually very nature oriented. If you look at where that came from, that's the same place as Druidry, the same place as witchcraft, as Wicca. So it's a natural world.
Yeah, and it just, like I said before, I think it's beautiful that more people are getting more in touch with the environment around them through this. That I think that I think that it could be that they're seeing this as a bit more in line with focus on the environment than even secularism would be.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think so.
I've been fascinated by seeing people going from atheism to paganism.
Right. Yes. They want something, but they
Yeah.
don't quite know what they want. But everybody can agree that whether gods exist or not, the natural world certainly does.
Yes.
You can't really deny that.
Yeah.
And we don't live, although I mean, many might contend that we do. We don't live in Discworld. Whether if you don't believe in the gods, they go around to the window and throw rocks through it. They don't do that quite, but maybe they do, sort of. But the natural world is visible, and it's there, and it's something that you can connect with and go out into. So I think that's very important.
Yeah. So wanted to ask, do you have any upcoming projects that we could be looking forward to?
Yes, I'm writing a book for Reaktion, who's the press that I wrote Miracles of Our Own Making for. And it doesn't have a title at the moment, but it's on folklore and shame and transgressive practices like skimity riding, which is when people essentially kind of have a go at their neighbours by mocking them and forming effigies of them and riding them through town and stuff like that. Terrible, really. I mean, some of this stuff is just licensed bullying. But there's a lot of this around sort of 12th night customs and Halloween customs and bonfire night customs, which was originally very political, obviously. So there's that. It's going to be coming out with Reaktion in 2024.
Oh, that's brilliant. And Bonfire Night is exactly where my mind went when you said that.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
Yeah, well, I greatly look forward to seeing that, and I hope I'll
Thank you
get to
so
talk
much.
to you again for it.
Yes, I hope so too. Yes, let's make a date. That would be great.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Oh, a pleasure. Thank you.
As I mentioned at the top of the show, you can read a review of Miracles of Our Own Making on the Folklore podcast website. And I'll put a link on the episode page for this episode for you so that you can go straight through and do that. The book itself, published by Reaktion Books, is available to buy wherever books are sold, both online and in actual shops. Don't forget to support your independent local bookshop wherever you can. Don't forget, if you're watching this on YouTube, you'll already know this, but if you're listening to the audio version, you can watch a lot of these interviews on the Folklore Podcast YouTube channel, along with various other bits of folkloric goodness in video form. I'll be putting more and more up there as time goes on, including the back catalogue of episodes that are not yet available on there too. So if you like to use that platform just to listen as well, then you'll be able to do that too. Make sure you pop along to the Folklore Podcast YouTube channel and subscribe for notifications when all of those things go up. And finally, the usual reminder that there is a Patreon page to support the podcast. Now, you can join this without parting with any money at all and still get extra content. But if you join on one of the paid tiers, and they do start for as little as £1 a month, then there's lots more to listen to and sometimes see or interact with, depending on the tier that you're on there too. www.patreon.com/the Folklore Podcast is the place to go to access that extra content and to support the show a little bit more. And I say this every time, but it really is true. Without that support, there would not be a podcast that has been running for 10 years with all of this free content for you to access. Any support is gratefully received. You can support financially on the website with the donate button too. Equally importantly, you can support without giving any money at all by just sharing episodes and interacting with the social media. The Folklore Podcast Facebook page has daily posts of little nuggets of folklore called Folklore Snippets throughout this year. And the Blue Sky account is very, very active for general chat and interaction. So I hope, if you're not there already, that I will see you on one of those. Thanks for listening. If you're listening, thanks for watching. If you're watching, and I'll look forward to seeing you again very soon.